All right, welcome back, AP. Oh man. So we are getting after some stuff today. I'm gonna try and breeze through this thing as fast as possible. It might end up taking me a little bit longer than I intentionally planned, but it is what it is. And it's some phenomenally interesting stuff, and it's mainly just about how the lives of people changed going into the 1700s and then ending up in the 1800s, right? So basically kind of that back tail end of the 16th century going into the 17th century, right? Because we talked about all these other things, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the enlightened absolutists, the growth of European commerce, just like all that stuff that we talked about over the break, and getting into the consumer revolution, or not, excuse me, spoiler alert, the industrious revolution, cottage system, putting out system, population growth, all that stuff. But now what we're kind of talking about is how it all kind of culminated together and it affected the three big classes in society, right? Now, but just a heads up, don't mute this, because I'm only putting some keywords on the display. A lot of extra info I'm going to be saying that you don't actually need to write down, but it's really, really your call. All right, so just you need to make sure you know the big keywords, things I zoom in on, stuff like that. But let's get after it. The very first thing we got to talk about is, of course, the changing lives of people in the 1700s, right? Now, this is all a review from class. We have talked about all this stuff already, all right? Marriage and family life, we're reviewing this stuff from class, right? Marriage, you got married much later in life. Average age now is going to grow to about give or take 25 to 27. Usually you got married now out of choice, not out of a marriage of convenience. You were brought on by new economic patterns. People began to work outside of home, and that's why people started getting married much later in life. Men apprenticed for several years. Women were serving homes of wealthy families. That is something I did not bring up in class because I kind of forgot. You see what I mean, Lucas? You see what you do? When you talk about all the he looked at his notepad. I got to try and remember these things, especially when I'm working from my board, right? But women are actually going to step outside the house and also acquire into this new economic pattern, kind of like a part of the putting out system a little bit, right? They're trying to find a different way to serve. What a lot of them did is they actually went and nannied in wealthy family homes, right? A lot of times they were very highly, though, disregarded or personally, mentally or physically abused by their madams, right? Which was a really big problem. And if they had gotten pregnant by the man that actually owned the home or something like that, and they were oftentimes cast out into society, had to resort to some Tomina-style ways of living, right, Tommy? You know that life. Now, remember, all of these economic patterns, though, are only prosperous moving forward past those tender ages of being trained if one was married, right? Which would then lead to what are we doing? What are we doing? Oh, calm down. There we go. Which would then lead to things like community controls, which we talked about, which is those early 1700s cooperative patterns of moral, social, economic standards. It's like your neighborhood police, right? The moral neighborhood police. Now, the statistic that I remember I threw up on the board, of course, related back to community controls, even though I was free think floating and it went under illegitimacy explosion, so just make sure you know it. 20% of all marriages after community controls popped up, there was already a pregnancy on the way, but only 2% of those kids were born out of wedlock. That's an example of the community control. However, as these things began to break down, and as people began to apparently run around and promise they would get married if one person got pregnant, and then kind of renegotiated those terms, right, following that, that led to your illegitimacy explosion, right? A big component of that population boom when the plague finally ended, healthier living standards, people being in a consumer-based society, all these other different items that actually went into it. Now, 2% of all births in 1700, of course, like I just said, were illegitimate out of wedlock. In some regions of Europe, for example, in Germany, 1 out of every 4 births by 1850 were out of wedlock, right? So that's a big example of that illegitimacy explosion. And a lot of us are wondering, but why? But why did it get so bad, right? A lot of it has to do with the fact that as prices rose, wages did not, right? Adam Smith was right. Stagnant wages are a bad thing. Since they didn't rise fast enough, a lot of illegitimate were actually born later on, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my face down here, and I'm going to reveal that stuff later because we're going to get to it in a little bit. But then we got into this when we were in class, children and education, right? Now that we have all these illegitimate children running around from this illegitimacy explosion and the failure of these community controls, right? Now you've got more kids being born, right? You got more kids being born, you got to figure out what you're going to do with them, right? So we talked about how infant mortality is still a big problem, right? We talked about how the 3 big causes of that, or we were getting into it, disease, right? Disease in the terms of typhus, scarlet fever, things like that. Also, just something as simple as early struggles in life, right? Not having the necessary dietary regimen. A baby could easily get a case of diarrhea and actually dehydrate themselves to death during the 1700s, which was a big problem. Poverty was another big issue that struck children, as well as a multitude of other things. Travel was a big danger to children, all kinds of other stuff. Not getting enough nutrients, blah, 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 blah. Children were still very vulnerable before adolescence, right? Nursing your child, though, was a way to try and help save their life, at first anyway. All right, so due to the fact that breast milk actually has a lot of viable nutrients in it, right? They actually had a lot of very, very positive effects, and it helped push the ideas forward of giving them immuno-boosting diets to actually help keep them alive, right? Now, poorer women that lived in the countryside were very big advocates of nursing your child. Sorry, I have a stopwatch on. I'm just trying to keep time, right? Big advocates of nursing their own children, mainly because they had to, right? Because they didn't have anywhere else to go. They lived in the countryside. There was no other option. However, urban women, the poorer and the wealthier, are going to begin to turn to this thing called wet nursing, right? Which became another component of the cottage system, right? The putting out system. The idea that you're now freelancing things out to other communities in the countryside, right? So urban women are going to turn to wet nursing. And what wet nursing is when you pay a woman, right, to actually feed your child. You understand what I'm saying? To breastfeed your child, right? Now, wealthy versus working women, two very different motivations, right? Wealthy women did it because they felt that nursing their own child was degrading, like lower than them, and also distracted them from their social responsibilities. And we wonder why infant mortality rate was still high in richer communities. Good Lord. Now, working women, it's because since they were entering into these seamstress factories and these textile organizations that were coming in from the cottage system outside of the country and then being prepared and manipulated and put together inside of the urban areas for these wealthy merchants, they needed work. So they didn't have time, according to historical documents, to actually nurse their own kids, right? So since that happened, they ended up turning to wet nursing. And again, giving them to women in the countryside. Some of these poor women that nursed their own children started nursing children of other women as well, right? Now, unfortunately, remember I said at first, when wet nursing began to boom in the 18th century, or not the 18th century, the 17th century, and got really, really out of hand, it actually ended up leading to a lot more infant mortality than they actually had expected, right? So nursing your child helps save their life early on. But when things kind of got out of control, it actually led back to infant mortality rates, right? And a lot of this is due to a lot of different things like travel. Travel was a big, big danger. If a carriage were to tip over, it's a good chance that that child will die, right? Too many children per nurse. Let's say one wet nurse was taking on too many kids. She didn't actually have the proper amount of nutrients to give to that child. If that child contracted a certain disease from not actually having immuno-boosting diets, they wouldn't survive, etc. 35% of all children in Europe, if they survived birth, would die before the age of 1 when the wet nursing business got out of hand. Another 20% of that surviving rate usually died before the age of 10, and this was a statistic taken from France during the 1770s. All right, so England, with their enclosure system that they mounted during that whole movement of following the open field system, 30% of their children actually made it to 10 years old, which is a lot better. All right, so, 30% did not make it. Wait, yeah, I'll double check on that statistic, but 30% actually, their rates were way better, all right, is what I'm getting at. Now, Enlightenment thinkers are actually going to come around, and they're going to rally against the wet nursing business, right? They're going to say, oh, well, we got to get away from this. You know, it's not fair that these kids are dying due to these different things. Which is going to kind of push against the wet nursing ideas, right? And that's going to bring in new ideas about children, how they should be educated, how they should live their lives, right? Well, it also brings on these ideas of infanticide and foundling hospitals, right? So if you can keep a child alive long enough, what they would actually go through is very, very different. Basically, like being a kid in Europe during the 1700s was awful. No bueno whatsoever, right? Now, infanticide was the practice of poorer women. If they did not have the means, funds, or the economic values to be able to keep a child, oftentimes they would keep their pregnancy a secret, deliver in secret, and then also smother that child, right? So what a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, and kill the child is what I'm saying. What a lot of Enlightenment thinkers began to advocate, therefore, were these things called foundling hospitals, where people could go and take their child if they did not have the means, the money, or the financial institutions enough to actually keep the child alive, to drop them off, right? Now, 1 out of every 3 child births, again, in France by 1770, were dropped off at foundling hospitals. Like, I mean, even wealthier women were doing this. This is a big byproduct of that big illegitimacy explosion, right? That we're like seeing all these kids born out of wedlock. Well, how do you get rid of this child? You drop them off at this orphanage, right? A foundling hospital is just a fancy word for an orphanage, right? Now, the thing about it is, see, this is all over the place. This is why I need, Haley, don't freak out, all right? So, like, I'm talking about this right now, this statistic, and now I'm getting this right there, okay? So, here's the crazy part, too, though. In those foundling hospitals, the kids only had a 50% chance of living, right? Even later in life, many more of them would actually end up dying even from other diseases or just trying to survive in those hospitals. Many Enlightenment thinkers later on actually began to call it legalized infanticide, right? So the foundling hospitals were no safer. Now, if your child survived, attitudes towards raising your child began to change, right? There used to be an old saying in the Middle Ages and, of course, in rural communities in Europe during this time period, spare the rod, spoil the child. Oh, he said spoil. Calm down, all right? Spare the rod means if you do not hit your child, then you are spoiling them, right? And if you're spoiling them, they will not be a contributing member of society. It's kind of messed up when you think about it, right? Now, that is actually going to change, though, and turn more towards these ideas of, like, Enlightenment tenderness, right? Being kinder to a child, increasing their ideas of literacy, right? Trying to read to them, advocating for the clothing that they wear. With this era of spare the rod, spoil the child, the idea of, like, strict discipline on your child, a lot of families would put children in, like, whalebone corsets to form their bones at early ages, or put them in miniature people clothes. Enlightenment tenderness said, don't do that, right? Don't do that at all. Give them big, big, oversized clothes so they have room to move around, right? Like, take care of that baby. And then with this is also going to bring on the spread of elementary education, right? Basically, kids began to go to schools at a much, much earlier age, of course, going into the 1700s, right? Where basic literacy was done, arithmetic, big other life skills that people were going to need to actually have. Girls also had separate gender education. A big part of their curriculum was apparently needlework, which is kind of screwed up. But that just kind of happened, all right? So now let's keep getting into it, though. Now, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, which is actually, I just think, really, really cool. It's pop culture in the 1700s, right? Now, pop culture in the 1700s is drastically different from the way that it is now. But let's talk about how people kind of got around, what they interacted with mostly in society. Now, I forgot to put a couple of pictures on this slide, but I'm not sorry. So let's go ahead and get after it. There was a huge rise in literacy, right? If your elementary education, after this illegitimacy explosion is happening, more people are walking around with the ability to read, right? So by 1600, 1 out of every 6 people in Europe could read, right? By 1800, 9 out of every 10. Oh, by the way, these are men. Sorry. All right, so anyway, now, 1 out of every 6 men in Europe could read, 1800, 9 out of 10. Now, this statistic is actually drawn from England, which is used as a representative body of work, right? Now, huge rise in literacy, though. Like, look at the gap there. That's insane. It's so big, right? The things they like to read, of course, more than anything else, what do you think the #1 book that everybody liked to read was? The Bible, right? Especially in Protestant communities. Protestant communities still trumpeted the idea that you read and interpret the Bible for yourself, right? Luther said that all the time during the Reformation. Now, the other big thing going forward, though, is, of course, the fact that we're talking about books that people like to read, right? So if there's a huge rise in literacy, that means there's a huge rise in the access to books, right? So lending libraries became a big thing. The library structure that you know of now became a very, very popular thing. Chapbooks became very popular. Chapbooks were these little pamphlets that had like religious stories in them, lives of saints, but they were printed on very, very cheap paper and very accessible to the poor, right? Other big thing was fiction, right? Different tales of witches and warlocks and trolls and gnomes and all these other new ideas. Crime thrillers came out. The novel was considered like a novel tale, right? And it was also like sometimes risque, okay? Fiction had a huge one. DIY pamphlets on how to do things on your own, and almanacs became very, very popular. And so Enlightenment ideas are also going to spread because of this boom in reading, right? If you're engaging in ideas, like if you're engaging with literature and seeing the ideas of the Enlightenment in print, or if you're hearing people talk about them in kind of enclosed spaces, like let's say hypothetically you were a servant, right? Let's say Lucas is the servant of Gillian Kenny, and Gillian Kenny just held a salon and Voltaire was over, right? All right, so now this is still really early. But if Lucas is hearing these Enlightenment ideas as a servant, when he goes out to the countryside where he lives, right, he might actually be talking to his family about the things that he heard at the salon, right? So like these different ideas about the Enlightenment and reading and literacy are going to spread. So what people like to do a lot to pass the time in the 1700s is read, right? So recreation's a big thing as well. In villages, the big things to do if you were bored or if you needed something to go on, make sure you've also put in the reading area lending libraries. I forgot to put it in there. Sorry about that. Now, another big thing, though, recreationally speaking, in villages, pubs and home gatherings were the big things to do if you weren't reading, right? If you weren't reading or imbibing in literature, and you had usually a neighborhood, village, or town had a tavern, right? So every village or town had a tavern, which kind of is a big part, culturally speaking, of most places like the Low Countries and in England. It's still very popular today, right? You were considered like an abomination of a village if you didn't have a tavern, right? So home gatherings were really big. People would meet up and actually exchange ideas, talk, communicate, share food, right? Urban areas, though, and towns, very, very different, right? Theater's still very popular. Lending libraries are still very popular. See, I knew I had it in there somewhere. Horse racing was very popular. Public fairs where people would actually go to imbibe on homemade goods and like eat roasted chestnuts and like, which is still very popular in Italy. And different things like that became very popular to do because now that you actually have time and cash in your pocket after the Industrial Revolution, people wanted to imbibe and things that they could spend their money on a little bit, right? Blood sports was still very popular as well. The big ones were cockfighting, bull baiting, bear baiting. All right, cockfighting, you know what that is? It's two roosters actually like fighting against each other. Usually they're very, very quick, and it's a lot of gambling going on. Bull baiting and bear baiting are a little bit different, though. Bull baiting is the big one that I like to talk about the most, but it's the same example, just two different animals, right? So bull baiting is when they would take a bull and they would tie it to a stick, right? And then they would release dogs out on the bull and see how long it took for the dogs to kill the bull or how many dogs the bull killed, right? So bulldogs, English bulldogs particularly, were actually originally bred to fight bears and bulls as well, but they gave them the name bulldogs because bulldogs can actually, American bulldogs and English ones, including pit bulls as well, were trained in like selectively bred because when they clamp down on something, like if they were to clamp down on a bear or a bull, they still have the ability to breathe because of their short face and also the fact that their muzzle is so big, right? So boxing, though, became very big as well, even though it's considered a blood sport. However, that was usually imbibed by the wealthy. Wealthy people like the idea of boxing because boxing was like, I don't want to watch animals kill each other. That's degrading. I want to watch two men kill each other. That's more bleh. All right, so female boxing was actually just as popular when the boxing trend actually started. Carnival is a big deal as well, right? Recreationally speaking. Carnival was big in Catholic countries. You know this as Mardi Gras, right? So Catholic revelry, dancing, drinking, very popular. It's all during the Lenten practice, right? And it usually comes like the week, I believe it's like the week before Lent starts, right? It's Fat Tuesday, Ash Wednesday, all those things where you're supposed to just kind of get together and rebel rouse and have a great time, right? So that's Carnival. Now, new foods are going to pop up as well during this time period. If I get too long on this flip, I'll probably cut it, and then we'll finish it up a little bit in class on Monday, which is not that big of a deal. Like I said, we're still ahead, so let's keep doing our thing. In the early 1700s, new foods are going to rise up. Even though bread, regardless, still the staple of the European diet, right? Actually, particularly it was rye bread that was still the staple of the European diet. Very dark bread, very coarse, but very good. Most people, like commoners in France in the Bordeaux region, apparently ate 2 pounds of bread a day, all right? So, like, you typically still ate bread, all right? That also brought on the idea of this thing called the just price, all right? The just price. The just price was this idea that there needs to be a reasonable price that bread is sold at. This is also a part of the big industrious revolution, the cottage system, the putting out system, all that stuff, right? Because if you had a just price, that is in justice or just understand, you don't understand what I'm saying. The price protects the consumer and the seller as well, all right? Now, if this just price was ever violated, that's how you end up usually having your bread riots, right? Which, of course, was a way that absolutists intervened later on to try and actually push forward their regiments, right? Push forward their ideas. Now, also in the 1700s and the early 1700s, people ate less meat than they did in the 1500s, mainly due to the fact that most of your land was owned by nobles or lords, so there were very, 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 very strict regulations on hunting because that was usually reserved for the noble that owned the land, right? So you actually ate less meat in the 1500s than you did in the 1700s. But you did have other goods that were your big common staples. You had your bread, beans, cheese and butter, because you never drank the milk. You never drank the cow's milk. It's too precious, all right? So apparently in the 1700s, early 1700s, you could imbibe dairy, but you had to do it not just drinking the milk because it made too many things, all right? So cabbages, carrots, wild greens were things that commoners ate. Commoners ate these things, right? Now, traders and merchants actually had access to other goods, right? They had New World veggies and fruits that they could actually get a hold of, but it still wasn't just quite that big yet. And a lot of you are like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, I thought you said they discovered the Americas in like 1492. How is it possible that they haven't figured this out yet? Well, it just is what it is, all right? So, because all things considered, all right, we're coming in about 20 minutes. So, all things considered, it takes time for these things, for the supply of these things to grow, for plantation economics to really, really take over, and for things to push forward, right? So, wealthy, though, the wealthy were huge carnivores. They ate meat all the time, usually fish or some type of dark meat or red meat, like cow. Venison was very, very popular. Pork when they could get a hold of it. But the main thing about them being huge carnivores is they also had, like, mixed in with these new veggies, these new vegetables, healthier diets for them. Now, like, they were actually imbibing on these New World delicacies like they were a new thing, get it? They also would sometimes spend 5 hours at dinner. That's insane. Now, speaking of all this New World stuff, though, by the late 1700s, the New World supply of foods became so prevalent that the poor could finally actually imbibe on them, right? So the supply was way, way, way up. Now, speaking of which, one of the big things that they wanted to try and always imitate the wealthy on were drinks, right? So the poorer communities would actually try to imitate the wealthy because then they felt they had more access to these things. And if the wealthy people are doing it, it must be better. It must be better for you. It must be better tasting. It must be better because they could afford it. Oh, wait, you mean I can actually afford these things now because they're all over the place, right? Because things, for example, let's use this right here as a good example. Tea. Tea became extremely popular in Europe during the later part of the 1700s due to the fact that the plantation economics in India and other parts of the world actually provided an ample amount of tea. And if you have tons of it, the wealthy can't buy all of it. So whatever you have left over, you would sell to the poor at a reduced rate. So you can actually prevent spoilage, right? Now, speaking of this tea, though, that's why it became so popular. Now, this is green tea, which is one of my favorites. Now, trying to make sure I don't get sick anytime soon. You know what I'm saying? Now, very, very prevalent among the poor, though. The wealthy had much more access to it, of course, okay? Now, another big thing was coffee that actually the poor became very, very apt to be able to afford. My favorite thing to talk about, though, that the poor finally began to afford was, of course, more meat is a big thing as it integrated in their diet in the late 1700s going into the 1800s, so like your 1780s. This is my favorite one, though. This is a picture from Spain. Hot chocolate. So chocolate became very, very popular during the late 1700s because there was a heavier supply and a more consistent supply of it coming from the colonies across the ocean, right? And drinking chocolate was usually the very, very popular thing. Darker chocolate was reserved more for the wealthier communities because it wasn't diluted down. But milk chocolate was actually diluted with milk, so it became a staple of poorer communities. And also, another big thing right here in the late 1700s, New World thing, what you need to put like big, big, big capital letters and underline it 6 times, you got it, Tommy, the potato. The potato was like one of the biggest deals to come out of the New Worlds, and I don't know how hard I can hammer that home. So I tell you what, if I can remember, I'll get that potato and I'll bring him in, and we'll start growing them now. And then we'll talk about the potato famine and stuff like that later on. All right, but we're going to cut it here, okay? We have, let me see, we have, I think, like 3 slides left, and that's all we got to get through on Monday, and then we'll have a flip. Yeah, just 3 slides. So we have 3 slides to get through. We talked about a ton of stuff today, though. The fact that I thought I could probably fit all this into a 20-minute flip is probably a little bit of an overstep, right? But it happens. It's not that big of a deal. Now, This stuff, though, we'll review a little bit when you come back in on Monday. And let's keep kicking butt. Like, we're getting after it. I see us finishing up the French Revolution easy before midterms, probably even getting to the other side of it. But let's see where we get first, all right? So y'all have a great weekend. Go Birds. I'll see you guys on Monday. Y'all have a good one.